Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Stephen Falgout.
And I am your other host, Don Falgu. Get Recc'd is our podcast where Stephen and I, two siblings, get together and recommend two pieces of media to each other, well, one each, be it an album, a game, or a film, or anything of the sort. And then in the next podcast, we get together and discuss each other's recommendations.
And what an episode it is.
The two
big
hottest artists of our generation coming together for a collaborative project. I'm, of course, referring to Stephen and I. And the collaborative project is reviewing two nobodies, I think. I don't know.
Right. But if you think about it, every two things that we rec on every episode are kind of like a collaboration. So you can take that to E! Norah Jones and Kendrick finally working together. The fans have been clamoring for it. They have been waiting patiently every day, and finally here it is. In the format of us talking about it in a podcast, reviewing each thing individually.
Yeah, and I would just like to really sympathize with our audience here for a moment, really get down on their level. You know, I am much like you. When I first checked out Kendrick Lamar, and I heard his records, I was like, you know who this reminds me of? Norah Jones. And, today I'm fulfilling the fantasy. So I'm, you can thank me later. You don't need to thank me right now. But...
Yeah, Don, you and I really are the every person. We are just like you, the viewer. We brush our teeth, we take a shower, we drive around in our Bugattis. We're just like you.
Yeah, and that's what Get Recc'd is all about.
And just like you, we've listened to Norah Jones' album that I recommended to you, Don. If you want to move into the recommendation.
Oh, I've never been more ready for anything in my fucking life.
So this is Norah Jones' Come Away With Me, which I recommended to you last time. Norah Jones, singer-songwriter, mostly and mainly popular during, I would say, the aughts, the early 2000s. Although she has continued to stay relevant, just not to the same degree as when she used to get radio play as much as she did, but also I guess that's maybe more the nature of current Billboard charts than anything else. This was Norah Jones's breakout album, Come Away With Me, 2002. So with that, I will hand it over to you to talk about your thoughts.
I would like to mention something which I don't really know if this means anything or if this really adds anything to anything, but the other day I was in The Habit Burger Grill and I heard the song doing what's it called? The one where she goes doing the same thing all over again. That one. It was playing.
Yes.
And I thought, I've heard this song before, so that's my story. And anyway, Norah Jones.
Well, what's crazy about that actually, Don, is I called that Habit Burger and made them play it.
Wow, you were just trying to remind me about this album before our show.
Correct.
I see. Wow, that's that's kind of messed up. But anyway, I like Norah Jones singing. I think it's nice. And when I was in The Habit Burger Grill, her singing was nice. So that's where I was going with that. Would you say
you bopped to the jam while you ate on your burger?
Well, I wasn't eating a burger. I actually was picking up a burger for someone else. But as for the jamming part, yes, I was jamming. So that's...
Would you say you went up to an employee of the restaurant and said, hey, is this Norah Jones, the song that goes doing the same thing all over again? And they said, yes, actually, it is that one.
I also happen to think that the cashier looked a little bit like Norah Jones, so there
Oh,
was that as well.
oh, wait.
Yeah,
Do you
so
think it was a live performance?
I I
Was
mean, if it was, that would go against what you told me about calling them to play it, unless, of course, you were calling Norah Jones
I was
specifically
calling
to
Norah
perform the
Jones
song for me.
to
So
both
I,
perform the song and, much like Undercover Boss, become a cashier for the day, where she had to throw her voice to both cashier and sing.
yeah, so I gotta say, Norah Jones
It was
really
elaborate.
talented that she could pull that off in that way, and that's my uh, most recent impressions of "Come Away with Me" by Norah Jones. So anyway, um, yeah, it's funny when you recommended this to me. I didn't think I knew who this was. Like I felt like I knew her name. I was like, oh, I feel like I've heard that before, but otherwise I had no idea. And then I put this album in, and like immediately I hear that song that I feel like I've probably heard more times in my life than I can count, and yet I can never recall anywhere I ever was when I heard it or where I heard it.
I, Now, I'm surprised that's the song that you have felt like you've heard so much and don't know why. Probably the
No,
biggest song off of this.
that's the one I'm referring to. Like I put the album in and it started with that song. Yeah, don't know why. That was the song I'm referring to. That's not the one they played at the Habit, of course, or that Norah Jones played at the Habit. But that's the song I was referring to. Because yeah, don't know why. I'd heard that. I'd heard that so much, and I was just, a little bit surprised. I guess I didn't realize that she was that big. And then I really think I very quickly understood why she was that big, because I do think, this album and these singles in particular, they almost feel like they are crafted from the top down to have mass appeal. And that's not inherently a bad thing, by the way. I'm not like saying that cynically. But it's such a smooth, easy to listen to record. The production is so like crystal clear, perfect, and pristine. The budget must have been high because it's difficult to record an album this well. There's few producers um, who could do that. Like honestly, the album sounds fantastic. Norah Jones, her singing and her songwriting is so palatable, like to just about anybody. It's like there really isn't any track here which would really turn anybody off or even really make them perk up in any way. And it feels like the album is designed to be played in the background of various establishments. Perhaps not the Habit Burger Grill. That was a little bit surprising. But if I were, say, in a coffee shop, this is exactly the kind of music I would expect to be there. It's like, it's very background. I think her songwriting, her vocals, the performances, everything is so understated that I would say this album exists pretty much as background music. And even for a singer-songwriter release, lyrically, it's fairly basic. It's not really. I don't really feel like this album is even designed to grab your attention very much at all. I think it's the sound. I think it's the sweetness of it that's just meant to charm somewhat passively. And from that perspective, I feel like Come Away With Me as an album would work in many environments. But it isn't necessarily something that allows me to connect with Norah Jones's music on this record in just about any way. It's very challenging to begin to actually listen to it intently and to actively listen to this record. And I feel like by doing so, I'm almost challenging it, because I don't know if that was even the aim of the record, was to be listened to actively. And yet that is, of course, the environment that I had to listen to it in, and that I would listen to it in. This is just how I listen to music. And so perhaps, perhaps I could say Come Away With Me isn't for me. That might be the simplest way to put it. But it would be for me if I liked coffee and was drinking it in a coffee shop. Then I think I would kind of vibe.
I can see your point. However, I feel like I have an not necessarily opposite viewpoint of this record, but maybe a tangential viewpoint in that I feel like because the nature of the album is kind of this like folk, smooth jazz record, and Norah Jones's voice and vocal performance absolutely lends itself to that. It does often feel like an album that you would put on or listen to in the background at like a coffee shop or like a melting pot or something like that. I feel like melting pot is the place I hear Don't Know Why the most. It's like melting pot plays it like every third song. But to me, that means I feel like when I do listen to it, it almost becomes a little more intimate. It's something that you hear a lot in the background, but when you really soak it in, it is very calming and relaxing. And the singles on it I think are great. She has actually a couple covers on it as well. So Hank Williams, a Hank Williams cover, and another one I think. I can't think of what it is, but um, I don't know if there's a single track on here I don't like, which you could interpret that as either because they're all just sort of so passive and relaxing, so none of them are like stand out one way or the other, or personally for me anyway, I find it very enriching. Maybe not, it definitely doesn't hit peaks like we've seen in some of the other albums that we've talked about on the show. Hands down, it does not. And certainly, I think that if you are going to go into this, like you usually do with albums, I can understand why there's not that same level of, I don't know if I would call it like depth or complexity, or you don't get that same fulfillment from like a really deep listen. But for me, this is like the perfect quintessential album to put on and just to kind of mellow to vibe with in a way that not a lot of other albums reach for me. I equate Norah Jones generally, and this is probably, I would actually say, definitely the album that I think was her best performing album of all of them, and I think that probably is her strongest album. But I equate Norah Jones almost to like a modern crooner. Like I feel like she fits very comfortably in that same kind of. It's like a modern take of your like 50s crooners. It definitely hits that level for me, and also I feel like that lends itself very naturally to like coffee shop sort of things. But this infusion of like slow jazz or smooth jazz, folk, and acoustic performance really just hit all the right notes for me on this one.
Yeah, well, and I grant that, like, so about the thing about the album being intimate, I definitely agree, and it is by nature that way. And I want to say I like that about it. I think here's the problem for me is that if you're going to really strip things back this much, if you're going to present these songs so intimately, I really want to feel like I'm close to the performer emotionally or cerebrally. Like I don't know what word I'm looking for here, but I want to get an idea of what their experience is, how they see the world. Some amount of personality, something that separates them enough so that intimate listening environment, I'm able to pull something out of it. And I just find Nora's songwriting so passe on the album. to the point where it's like, I just think there's nothing to grab from the songs themselves. And this album, I think it's 14 tracks, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's 14 tracks, and I think it's under 50 minutes. However, I will say that about 7 tracks in, I thought the album was almost over. Like, it, there's there's so little like things to pull out of any song that I kind of feel more like it becomes a bit of a patience test. She just isn't on this record. She wasn't really saying anything. And when I say that, I don't mean she has to be making some big points or anything. It's just that, you know, a lot of these songs, they're these gentle love songs and things like that. But lyrically, I wouldn't say any of these tracks do anything really all that interesting. So at that point, I'm listening to the singing, and her singing is good. It is nice, although it never really goes any extra steps. So I feel like once you've heard the opening track, Don't Know Why, you've heard pretty much her entire range you're going to be hearing on this whole album that she's going to be presenting for you. It's kind of the same thing every time. And so then I kind of look like instrumentally and musically, okay, well, you know, maybe it's not really a lyrically focused record. Maybe it's all about the sound. And from the production side of things, that's masterful. I think this album sounds lovely, but from the instrumental musical side of things, you know, it's just not really a lot going on. And I think that's kind of my frustration, I guess, I had with the record, which was that there is a lot of space for something really special to come through, but it just never really does in any particular aspect. It's like, because the music is so soft and gentle, there's so much room for some other element to take focus, like Nora's singing, or maybe her lyrics, or maybe like just the performances of the instrumentalists managing to maintain this environment, although none of those things really wield much in the way of intrigue for me. So again, I just kind of fall back on feeling like the album is a little bit background music-y, and then that's, I guess, ultimately the problem, which, I mean, again, you didn't even necessarily disagree with. And I think I would grant that, like, as a somewhat background listening album, like as something you would put on to you know, you're not going to like not pay attention to it at all, but it's there to enhance something else that you're doing. I can see why it would work from that perspective. But I think, like, I feel like there's plenty of albums that can do that, but that also, when I listen to them more closely and when I really treat the album itself as the thing that I'm doing, I can also get something out of it from that angle. And that's just kind of where I guess I feel like this album fails. And the last thing I wanted to say was just that on that point about how it's 14 tracks, I don't know if I've really illustrated exactly how boring I find this album to be, because I can talk about all those things from those angles, but like, if I took any individual track off of this record and listened to it, I think I would enjoy it okay. Like, I definitely cannot say that the music or the songs are bad in themselves, because they really aren't. Like, I don't think there's a single track here where I'm like, oh my God, that was just really weak. You know, it's fine. Like, I think Don't Know Why is a perfectly serviceable, pretty good track. But like, when it's taken all in totality, with 14 of these songs back to back to back, and so few of them differentiate themselves whatsoever, which is not to say that that all the songs sound exactly the same, but it is to say that the vibe is the same on like every single song. It becomes so taxing, because I just need something to pay attention to at some point, and I don't get it like from start to finish. So this album doesn't really feel like it's like, you know, in that 40 to 50 minute range, which I think it is. to me, this thing felt like it's like over an hour and a half. I mean, by the time I get to track 7, I'm already looking at the time like I can't believe this is only halfway over. And the songs aren't that long, and nothing is that long, but I just don't. I'm just never brought into its world and or to anything that Norah has to say about love, relationships, and whatever else. It leaves me cold in that way.
I do want to address Pova in the chat had mentioned that a lot of the writing credit did not go to her. So that is true. We do acknowledge that she did not necessarily have writing credit on all these songs. A lot of them were covers, but she did have writing credit on quite a number.
Wait, here's a question then, because I haven't looked into that and I didn't recognize any covers. So, how many songs are covers, and how many songs are just not written by her? I know she did write some of these tracks.
Just 2 songs are covers. Cold Card Heart is a Hank Williams song originally.
Makes sense. It sounds kind of country, yeah.
And the other song was The Nearness of You, which was a Hoagie Carmichael song originally. That was the 14th track. Other than that, she either had writers that wrote the song or she had writing credit on the tracks.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I thought she was the main songwriter, although she may just be one of a few songwriters. I mean, look, it doesn't really make a difference. Whoever wrote the songs, I suppose. I guess I credited it to her, but I don't think personally, I don't think it would be any better or worse if she wrote them or not. I don't necessarily care about that.
Plus, I would say in this situation, I would say it's particularly hard to ascertain what that means because she had her own, herself, obviously a singer-songwriter, but also a band that she's worked with for a very long time, and a lot of the writing credit on this track goes to her band. So I'm sure even though she's not listed as the primary writer, she probably most likely had a hand in at least co-writing or bouncing ideas off. So it's hard to say. But yes, we do acknowledge that she doesn't necessarily have lead writer credit on all these songs.
Oh, and if I can address one thing in the chat, as you did, Angela says, this won a major award back in 2003. Nobody remembers this album. I have to concur. I will not concur. Sorry, the opposite of concur. I have to disagree that nobody remembers this album because it really just depends on who you're talking about. And also,
it played in a Habit Burger.
It literally. I don't know if
you've heard of Habit Burger before.
It didn't even just play in a Habit Burger. Norah Jones performed it in a Habit Burger, which I visited, and I was one of few patrons at that time. So she did that especially for me. So no, I do think it is somewhat relevant today. And I also think, in addition, like the Grammy audience of a lot of Grammy winning albums is very different than perhaps the people who maybe I or perhaps Angela here would be speaking to. But I definitely think this album has at least somewhat of a legacy. I think people still listen to this and listen to songs. And as I said, I'd heard some of these, particularly Don't Know Why. Really just that one. I'd heard a million times.
I was going to add that I was actually very surprised to learn, based on the Wikipedia article, that as of right now, Come Away With Me, the album by Norah Jones, is the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, like in the top 30 best-selling albums of all time.
Really? Okay.
Kind of crazy. It has sold 19.9 million copies.
Wow. Yeah.
Puts it very squarely. It puts it above Celine Dion and Mariah Carey.
Wow.
Okay. Well, with that, I guess we could. And Angela, no, don't worry. I don't know if you would say you were wrong. I can understand that. Like, I don't feel like it gets as much airplay necessarily. But if you ever go into a coffee shop, you'll definitely hear Norah Jones if you stay long enough.
Or a Habit Burger. Or a Habit Burger.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, no, I agree. I don't know if I really hear this album much on airplay or really even anyone talk about the album. People certainly still talk about Norah Jones or songs, but not necessarily the album that much.
I think really quickly before we wrap it, I'll just say, like, on that point, like, I don't know why they would, because I think even people who probably do like this album, I don't know how many people could really say this album is so spectacular or so special in so many ways that it necessarily deserves you know, to still be being like talked about to this day, like one of the greats or something. And I also think that just because something won a Grammy, I don't necessarily think that means that really anybody would say that about it, right? Like, I think it has its place in the speakers of coffee shops. And, you know, that's a place that it has. And habit burgers. Sorry. All right. We can wrap it up now. I guess I start, right? We're going to wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so look, I'm not like I'm not really talking about this album in like overtly negative terms. It feels very neutral to me, and that's kind of the way that I've been discussing it. I suppose I think that for me, you know, for me, it's just when I think about my personal enjoyment of listening to this entire record, I would give it like a 4 because I do feel like it actively bothers me to some degree just how much I am unengaged by the record throughout its runtime. And also by the fact that I don't necessarily have many points of praise to even give to it that I could give to the whole album, really, aside from like the production of the record, which again is fantastic. It's lovely. It sounds great. Um, you know, I think like what I recommend this album, it's like it really depends on who you are and what you're doing. I mean, I think that this album does have really widespread appeal. I think lots of people would really like this record. I don't know how many people are going to hear it and be like, oh, yeah, this is one of my fucking favorites. You know, I rep Norah Jones, Come Away With Me, one of my top 10 favorite albums of all time or whatever. But like, I think a lot of people will absolutely really like this album. Again, it feels designed to be a very palatable, easy to listen to record. And it does accomplish that. So, you know, it's like for me though, it's definitely not for me. It's definitely not my thing. And that is my take. Okay.
You want to rate it?
I did. I gave it a 4. I would give it a 4.
You want to rate it again?
I would give it a 10.
Okay, now we're talking. I really like this album. I like it a lot. To your point, I wouldn't go to bat for it and say it's like one of the greatest albums of all time, but I just really enjoy Norah Jones, and I think that this is certainly the album that has the most consistent quality of track. Whereas I feel like other albums, although still very listenable and enjoyable, don't have the same kind of oomph as some of the singles like on this one do, for instance. I would probably give it honestly as high as like an 8. I mean, Don't Know Why is one of my favorite songs of all time, just straight up. I know that you weren't as high on it or just generally as high on this album as I may have.
I do like that song. I do think that song is very good.
But this is just an album that really has always clicked with me from first listen to every listen that I have afterwards. It's not something I listen to all the time. It's something I'll put on occasionally and just really relax and vibe to. But for the most part, like if you like the old crooner sound, if you like the smooth jazz acoustic pop, like this is certainly one of the best examples of those types of albums. It won't click with everybody, and it's not deep at all. Like you're not going to find a lot of complexity here, but I really enjoy it for what it is, and I would recommend it because it is very easy to listen to. I mean, you put it very succinctly in that you can literally just put it on in the background.
Yeah.
In fact, that's probably where it shines the brightest, to be honest.
Yeah.
Just like have your coffee in the morning, put it on in the background, stare out a window longingly, and do nothing else. And there you go.
And later at lunchtime, go to the Habit Burger and see Norah Jones live in concert.
Yeah, cashiering.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Well, I think with that we should move on to what I recommended you last time, Steven.
Definitely not a tonal shift at all, but yes, let's go for it.
Well, of course it isn't, because these two artists have now collaborated in the Bit World's greatest musical collaboration of all time. And that's, of course, here on Get Recc'd tonight. So anyone here to witness this, you are here for an event. But of course, last time I recommended to Steven the newest album by Kendrick Lamar, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. This is Kendrick's 5th album.
Yeah. Don't let anyone tell you we don't look at new stuff.
Yeah, this is like months old now, but it was new, kind of new when I recommended it. And I think even then it was a couple months old, but
Oh, it says 2022 on there,
2022.
and it is 2022.
And it doesn't say the month. So, it's universally 2022. And guess what? If you look at your calendar right now, if you're watching this live, it is 2022. So
this album is releasing every day.
Listen,
every time you go to listen to this album, it has just released. It's crazy.
Unless it's 2023 or onward, in which case, this shit's old.
And it's old.
So anyway, this is Kendrick's 5th album, yes, I believe, if we don't count Untitled Unmastered, which I don't think counts as a full studio project. This album is a double album, which is still weird to me because it's shorter than at least To Pimp a Butterfly, which is a single album. But anyway, I guess it's about the 2 discs and having 2 separate discs, which it does have. And I'm just gonna leave the rest of it to Steven here to talk about.
Well, every time you go, wait, do you count the Black Panther?
That's right, I forgot about that. No, I don't, but I forgot that happened. But you're right, that I think that is credited to Kendrick Lamar specifically.
I think it is, and I think he will very likely have a hand in this upcoming one as well, the second movie. Okay, so I will start with a few disclaimers, maybe one major disclaimer. I listened to this on Spotify, and I think I lost something, probably a very minor thing, but I believe this album itself is actually either 2 discs or like it's very specifically structured in 2 categories.
It's 2 discs, yeah.
Okay, yeah, and those discs are Big Steppers and Mr. Morale, or at least that's how they're structured. When listening to it on Spotify as a digital listen, there was no differentiation. It's just one long track list. Again, I don't think it really changes much. However, I do feel like there's a conscious decision to have those things separated, and I did not have that differentiation or separation. So I just listened to it as one long track list. The other thing about the digital track list is there was a bonus track, I believe, that was only digital that I did listen to, but I won't talk about here. We will just keep it to, because I don't know if we've ever...
Part 5, is that the one?
That is the one, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if we've ever mentioned this, but generally when we are talking about or recommending something, especially when it pertains to an album where there can be so many different versions, we tend to very specifically just talk about primary tracks. So we're not talking about deluxe edition tracks. I think Come Away With Me, which we just talked about, has like a super deluxe edition that has like double the track length plus outtakes plus like raw recordings or whatever. I don't know if we've ever mentioned that before, but that is how we think about these things, is just the pure album experience as a physical release album experience. So we tend to not talk about like digital only tracks or anything like that. Unless it was a digital only album, then anything's fair game. But like in this case, to be very specific with an example, I would just be talking about the 18 tracks, not inclusive of a last track that was a digital track that I did listen to on Spotify. Okay, with those couple disclaimers out the way, I don't think they really change much in my opinion at all, but just wanted to mention. Anytime we talk about Kendrick, it is like, you really gotta strap in. I mean,
yeah,
all of these, any Kendrick album is just so heavy, so immediately, and throughout the whole thing, like you are in for a ride. I will say this before I start talking about this album in specifically, holistically. I felt personally like this album was the most inconsistent, maybe is how I would call it. I felt like from track to track, it wasn't as... I would probably say consistent as I felt like some of Kendrick's past albums have been. I probably, like, if I'm thinking about the recent chronology, I would definitely put this above the last major album, but not above the one before that. So I would put it above Damn, but I still think To Pimp a Butterfly is kind of like the shining example of Kendrick's work. This album went into a lot of, and they always do, but a lot of very heavy themes, a lot of introspective themes, a lot of very personal grief and trauma that obviously was probably not very easy to create an album about. Very conscious, both in its creation, but then also in its desire to create some sort of relief or exhale from being able to talk about these things. So that was very interesting. I think that has, Kendrick in the past has alluded to some of these things, but usually talked about more widespread societal issues or introspective issues as they pertain to, or personal issues as they pertain to wider societal issues. But this is like, a lot of these tracks are talking about purely internal grief and trauma that was very interesting to listen to. And I think that's where this album shines the brightest, is in those tracks. But I'll be honest, some of these were even hard for me to listen to. We Cry Together, that was like so much. Like, I was not ready for that. I've listened to this album now 3 or 4 times, and every time it gets there, I'm not ready for that. And that can be in itself very interesting, because it is so powerful. It is so combative and aggressive. But I felt like that happened a few times in this album where it was almost too much for me, which, maybe in some way that in itself can, make you really like think about certain aspects of your life or what have you. But because of that, I felt like the highs and lows here, like, I felt like it was inconsistent in that aspect, in both its aggressiveness and its like desire to want to say something, but then also just inconsistent in like its track quality.
Okay,
So I
yeah.
will take a pause there.
Yeah, well, definitely I would agree with that. I think that it might be the most difficult to listen to of any Kendrick album, and I feel like each of his records have those moments. Each of his records have some really troublesome tracks on them, which are challenging to hear, the things that Kendrick talks about, because he always has been so introspective and so vulnerable. Even in something like Good Kid, Mad City, like, that's presented as like the story of his life, and it's difficult there. It's difficult in To Pimp a Butterfly when you have tracks like You or The Blacker the Berry or such, which very heavy topics. And then on Damn, like, Damn was a very depressive record, which this continues in the footsteps of. I mean, really, I feel like since To Pimp a Butterfly, his records have been very depressive. But I feel like what makes Mr. Morale like especially challenging is just how much Kendrick deconstructs himself as a performer and allows more of that to come through than ever before. And much of it is, I think, because on this album, Kendrick wants you to see him as more imperfect than he ever has. And I suppose, dating at least back to
I'll say quickly, just to interject there, and very specifically and upfront in track like Savior.
Yeah. And it's something that Kendrick's been saying since To Pimp a Butterfly. A lot of To Pimp a Butterfly was equally about that, but I feel like it's gotten more and more explicit up to now, where I think that these issues have plagued him for a really long time. His savior complex that he has, that he feels that because he's in an elevated position, that he needs to be the he needs to be the savior of entire communities because he feels like he's been talked about in that way. And I think it's obviously an unfair burden he's placed on himself, and I really do think he placed it on himself. I don't, I think like he wasn't prepared to have been seen as like the famous conscious rapper. But I don't necessarily think that all of society or all of his listeners legitimately expected him to be perfect. But regardless of whether they did or didn't, like he felt that they did, and it weighed on him so much that this entire record is designed to strip that away, and it does so, I think, in ways such as on "We Cry Together," where he's showing the ugliest aspects of his life, and then we have a track like "Mother I Sober," where he just really starkly presents his trauma that he's experienced throughout his life and the trauma that he feels has shaped the way he has acted and the way he thinks other rappers have also acted, which is a whole nother aspect of the album, is his belief about the way that all Black people in this country have trauma that they carry, and that the performers, Black performers, carry that trauma into their work. And that's like a big position that he takes on this album that also shapes his perspective. So I think like, topically, it's heavy, and there are tracks on here, namely the ones you mentioned, which, I mean, it makes this album not like a one you can just put on and vibe to, which maybe a lot of people want from Kendrick, which, I mean, I guess I find odd because I don't know that any of his music's ever been like that. Maybe his first album and like maybe some tracks on Good Kid, but with his music, it's always a real endeavor to sit through, and it's a very cinematic experience. And I feel like Mr. Morale still is that. And when it comes to the consistency, I think you raise a fair point. And one of the reasons why the album, I think, can be so inconsistent is partially just because the sound of the album is a lot more all over the place than maybe any of his records have ever been. You have To Pimp a Butterfly, which I feel like, despite the fact that it's a very sprawling album with a wide range of influences and tracks that sound different from each other, you can trace it all to one core sound and one core like musical identity that it has. You can't really do that as well with Mr. Morale, and especially as the follow-up to Damn, if we are saying that it is, and I think it is. Like, Damn was a very radio-ready commercial album for Kendrick, and this album still has that in it for sure, but then it also at other moments contains some of his most experimental work yet. So it is a very, much in the vein of the lineage of double albums throughout time, it is messy, it is sprawling, and it really is all over the place. And it is true that some tracks just aren't necessarily as strong as others. Although I will say, I think it really added for me to the flawed persona that Kendrick is trying to inhabit. Like, the fact that the record itself feels flawed, the record itself doesn't feel completely put together. I found that really interesting, and it added a lot to the point I think he was trying to make for me.
Yeah, well, with all that being said, I do very much enjoy, on the whole, more than I don't enjoy on this album. I mean, there are is still so much brilliance in the lyrics from track to track, even if I do feel like sometimes either tonally or just by the nature of the, I don't know, like rhythmic quality in some cases, or some of the times when I feel like there's a little too much dead air or just some odd flourishes between tracks. With those aside, like just listening to what Kendrick has to say on every track is just so engaging. And I mean, starting with United in Grief, it's like right out the gate, it's like, okay, Kendrick is back. Like you can hear it right away. And that it is so raw emotionally, so introspective, so personal is just really captivating. And like you mentioned, not necessarily different from the past, but certainly it has never been to like this level of like very specific personal moments in his life, or personal periods of grief in his life. And that is really what elevates this album for me. And I think I had mentioned it before, but that's where I really feel like this album shines.
Yeah, totally. And speaking of United in Grief, I mean, that's just one of the craziest instrumental songs. Like, just instrumentally, that's one of the craziest beats he's ever rapped on top of, and yet he's at the prime of his game on it. And same with any other beat. And a lot of beats here too take on a lot of influences from much more popular hip hop styles than Kendrick has in the past. Although he did a little bit of that. Well, he did a lot of that on Damn. But here, a track like Die Hard, for example, which is one of my favorite tracks, it kind of sounds like that vibey kind of R&B influenced style of hip hop that's popularized by, people like Drake. Some of that's on this album, or Rich Spirit even. And then you have like trap instrumentals like Silent Hill, which wouldn't sound out of place with so many other rappers you can hear on the radio today. And I think I find it impressive how Kendrick was able to get on top of these beats, and he sounds just as fiery as ever before. Like, he routinely proves that he cannot be shoehorned into anything musically, and I found that so impressive on this album. So even like just purely from a technical perspective, I feel like this album was on fire, and really amazing from that angle too. But one thing I want to get into before we finish, one last thing, is about that point about Kendrick presenting himself as a flawed narrator on this album. I think that Kendrick says things on this album which are just outright disagreeable at times. And I feel like everybody has found something in this album that they did not agree with or that was upsetting. And, it's sprinkled all throughout the record. I feel like for the first time, it really feels like Kendrick is not... He kind of, in a way, successfully deconstructed the savior complex, because I feel like people are questioning him more than they ever have on a very wide level. I mean, I don't know if you saw a lot of the discourse around this album from any various places, whether it be from the media or on social media or wherever else, but this album has a lot of controversial tracks. There were a lot of controversies around certain decisions Kendrick made on this album, or just certain songs themselves. One of the biggest ones being including rapper Kodak Black on this album, who has a history of sexual abuse allegations. And it's not even like it's something Kendrick overlooked. That was like the reason he included him. And then you also have like the song Auntie Diaries, where Kendrick talks about transgender family members, and he dead names and misgenders them because he's like playing a character of himself in the past when he used to be ignorant. But many people took issue with the fact that he even did that anyway, because they really felt like it wasn't his place. That's a topic I've gone into endlessly elsewhere, and I won't necessarily go into here, but it's like, there are a lot of things which Kendrick does which are disagreeable on this record. And I found it interesting, I guess, that listening to this, that I felt like the album was brilliant in all of those flaws, in all of those disagreeable elements and problematic elements throughout this record. It feels like when I'm listening to this, I'm legitimately being challenged. And like listeners are legitimately being challenged by the lyrical content of this record. Whether or not some of that stuff is stupid or not, like, there's genuine challenges presented to me. I did not listen to a Kendrick album and hear a bunch of stuff I already agreed with when I listened to this album. And I feel like a lot of listeners felt the same way. And I found that very interesting. Like, I have my own points of criticism with various things on the record, but I just found it interesting that for the first time, it really felt like a Kendrick album came out and a lot of people didn't really see him as like a perfect genius who knows everything about these social issues. And it's like, well, that is kind of what he wanted, I suppose, after all.
Okay, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is one that is a little hard for me. I think on the whole, I would easily give this album a 9. This is not a Kendrick album that gets a perfect 10 for me, and quite a number of them do. I just, to my earlier point, this one was the one that was most combative. I think most aggressive personally for me, where I felt like it was at times hard to listen to, and I also felt like at times it was very inconsistent. Um, and because of that, I would not give this album a 10, but I definitely recommend it as a listen. I think that there's just, Kendrick, anytime he comes out with something, it's always so immediately interesting and captivating. And this continues to be that, even if I don't think it's necessarily as great as some of the stuff in the past. I would absolutely recommend it still.
Yeah, I would also give this album a 9 myself, and I would say that this really stands right up there as one of his best albums. I think, it's behind Good Kid, Mad City and To Pimp a Butterfly, but I also think those albums are so amazing that there's almost no chance he would top them, and that's fine. But I think he's definitely topped everything else he's done with this record. But I also just think, it was one of his most interesting albums. It was one of the most interesting albums I've heard maybe ever, just purely in terms of how much this album got me thinking and how many conversations I had because of this album. It really was more than perhaps any other record I've ever heard in my life, in terms of discussing the ideas and the things that are on the album. I think it's a big moment in a lot of ways for a lot of different things, and I was thoroughly impressed by all of that. And yeah, I mean, I would absolutely recommend the album if you somehow haven't heard it yet. I think if you've ever liked Kendrick, you're going to find this album fascinating. And just, it's just, I don't know, it's just awesome. I don't know where I was going with that, but it's awesome. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. I think that we should move on to recommendations because we are done with those two things. If you are ready, then you would go first if you're ready.
Sure. Okay. Next time, I am recommending to you something that is in a different format than stuff that we have recommended in the past. However, we have tapped into this medium a few times, kind of sort of in a roundabout way. And I guess the way that we will experience this together will also be not quite the full experience, but I am recommending to you a board game called The Lost Ruins of Arnak. This was a 2020 board game originally. They came out with an expansion, which I will include in this recommendation, which came out in 2021, the very end of 2021. It really only hasn't even been truly starting to be fulfilled until this year. So again, don't say we don't play any new things. Lost Ruins of Arnak is a board game where you are a group of adventurers exploring the island of Arnak to uncover its and to learn about its resources and potential discoveries. So next time we will talk about the Lost Ruins of Arnak.
All right, and that'll be interesting. We did talk about a card game before, although we talked about a digital version of it. So this will be truly, truly different. As for my recommendation for you, I am going to recommend the album Knife Man by AJJ. AJJ, formerly known as Andrew Jackson Jihad, which is what this album was released. The name this album was released under. They are a folk punk, anti-folk band from Phoenix, Arizona, native Phoenicians. And Knife Man was their fourth studio album, or fourth solo studio album anyway. That wasn't a split. And I don't know what else to add to that, so I guess that's it. I'm recommending Knife Man for next episode. And with those recommendations out of the way, that pretty much does it for this episode. So I think it immediately is important to apologize for the inconsistency of podcasts lately. It's just things have been complicated. Things get complicated. You know how it is. We are, however, hoping, although we might have said this last time too, so sorry, but this time I think we mean it. We are hoping to be able to do these on a more regular basis as we used to be able to do for the upcoming few months at least.
Yes, I moved into a new home in the middle of our recording break, so it ended up taking up much more time than I expected. So now that that's all done, hopefully we can, as you mentioned, get onto a more regular cadence, because we can't have Ninja back if we're not keeping up with the Fortnite occurrences.
True. That's true. And we need Ninja, so we need
Ninja just refused.
Yeah, so, as always, everybody, you can check us out on CastBox, Get Recc'd. We're there. It'll be linked in the description if you are listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, I suppose. Listening on CastBox, watching on YouTube. And if you are listening on CastBox, you can find us on YouTube on the channel Casting 404. We actually stream these podcasts live every time we do them, so you can always catch that live and hang out in the chat if you would like. And I think those are the things that I say. And I just, I want to continue to thank everybody for being here. And I don't have anything else to say, I don't think. So if you don't either.
No, thank you again, everyone.
Then with that, those were our thoughts and those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.